Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to come to the presentation, Negotiating Artistic Identities as a Young Artist in the Cosmopolitan Society. I'm Joan. Some of you might know me as the symposium coordinator spamming your inboxes. I apologize for that. This is Jellal. He's a Year 2 composition major, and with us are Vanessa, a Year 2 Harp major, and Xin Tong, a Year 2 music collaboration and production major. Today we'll be bringing you through our experimentation and collaboration process of finding our own artistic identities, which led to the composition of our new piece. So before we begin, perhaps it makes the most sense to talk a bit about how this entire idea came to be. In Singapore, race is very important. And no, I don't mean the F1 race, though that is kind of important too. But I mean the categorization of humans into groups based on shared physical or social qualities generally viewed as distinct within a given society. So for example, when applying for housing or jobs in Singapore, you are required to declare your race in your applications. And in the past, visitors to Singapore will have to declare their race as well on their SG arrival card. This information requested holds quite a few assumptions to one's identity. In the short 58 years of Singapore's independence, the country has built its reputation as a multiracial, multicultural society, which plays a vital role in our country's national identity. This concept of multiracialism and multiculturalism is often a quality that we see in Singaporean composers, which Singaporean composers would try to highlight this through instrumental combinations, which utilizes instruments from various cultures, combining Eastern melodies with Western orchestration, amongst other methods, in attempts to construct a Singaporean sound. However, this raises the question of whether isolating and adopting a few elements from each individual musical cultures will bring about a new musical identity. It also raises an issue of what gets included or omitted, and even the concept of categorization of races and cultures itself. So after all, in today's cosmopolitan globalized society, there is an overwhelming variety of influences that affect us both as individuals and as growing musicians, more than ever. And so as a result of all these burning questions we had, some of us came together and explored the ways in which we could potentially create a new, unique musical identity beyond the juxtaposition of musical elements from different musical cultures. And so today's presentation is a result of our experimentation. We'll begin by talking a bit about the different musical and extra-musical identities seemingly at conflict with one another, followed by the deconstruction of these identities and the resynthesis of them into a new one. Ultimately, the piece that resulted from our experimentation highlights our main idea, that the deconstruction and resynthesis of one's identities is the key to constructing one's own artistic identities. We've picked out a couple of identities common amongst the four of us, and we've tried to break down what each of these identities entail and how it has influenced our musical journey. So firstly, being Western classically trained musicians. For a start, all four of us are currently or were students of this conservatory, majoring in composition, harp performance, or music collaboration and production, with an area study in piano performance. So the conservatory training we had, together with the ABRSM music syllabus most of us took prior to entering the conservatory, meant that a large portion of our musical foundations stemmed from Western classical music. From score reading, music analysis, and oral skills, the precision expected in performances and notations, down to the music in which we were exposed to as children. Secondly, being born and raised in an Asian society. So not so coincidentally, the four of us come from Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, respectively. And while in some ways our countries are very different from one another, we are all exposed to certain Asian cultures and their music, specifically that of Chinese music and Balinese gamelan music. The exposure to Chinese chamber music as well as gamelan music through the schooling systems meant that our musical journeys were also shaped by Asian aesthetics. For some of us, such as Xin Tong and our friend Ping Din, who's in the crowd, this was much more evident as they juggle between the Western musical training of ABRSM and the musical training required to learn the Guzheng and the Erhu respectively. Beyond the music itself, it also being brought up in an Asian household also meant that we had exposure to different ideas, philosophies, and ways of life. So a classic example would be what I like to call agaration. Always estimating ingredients in cooking and never having precise measurements. So I used to ask my grandma how much water to put in flour in order to make pancakes, and she would just say aga, which means watch with your eyes, estimate. My pancakes never did quite taste like us, so well. But this approximation and the appreciation for the differences that results from this approximation could be seen to be contradictory to Western conservatory style training which we are accustomed to. For example, the notes A4 is tuned to a fixed frequency like 440 or 442 Hertz, and people argue about it, which is precisely determined by empirical means, such as by using a tuner. So by extension, Western conservatory training has, for us, resulted in a standardized concretization of music through music theory and notation. Thirdly, being Gen Zs in a generation where culture is no longer being constrained by geo-demographic limitations, and how technology as well as the internet plays a crucial role in shaping our understanding of the world, the arts, and music. So for one, we are now accustomed to the fast transmission of information and its conveniences which technology brings. By extension, technology has become commonplace for us. More importantly, technology and the internet allows for easy access to information and resources regardless of geographical locations. I could be in Singapore and still learn about the musical cultures in other places through internet searches, or even watch concerts through live streams, as many of us who have experienced during the pandemic. What this also means is that we are being constantly fed information, which are constantly interacting and influencing us. We need to find a way to make sense of this overwhelming amount of information, to be discerning of them, to incorporate and or to omit them from our lives. So with these three identities that make up a significant part of our lives, the question remains as to how these identities could be used to shape our own artistic identities. So a possibility we have recognized would be to deconstruct these identities down to their fundamentals and then resynthesize them into something unique. But why deconstruction and how? So has anyone played Lego before? Yes, kinda. I see a lot of people in my generation saying yes, we had a childhood. So, so let's think of this as Lego. You want to build a Lego ship with living spaces of a house, and you're given a ship Lego set and a house Lego set. But due to the shape, size, and sheer incompatibility of these two things, it's impossible to put the house on top of the ship and make it work. I mean, you could, but it may look kind of weird and disproportionate. I don't know, I've never tried, so you can try it. But instead, what we think may be helpful to effectively construct a ship house is that we take both the Lego sets apart into its individual blocks and analyze what they are and how they can be pieced together to build a new ship house. In other words, a cruise ship. So this also applies to composition, where if we want to better assimilate cultural and musical identities, we may need to deconstruct the elements of music and identify which of them are associated with with which of these musical cultures, and to what extent are they associated with them. So to illustrate this further, let me pass the time over to Jellal, who will take you through the deconstruction of our musical identities and how they will resynthesize in our piece.
So for the scope of this experimentation, we have chosen to deconstruct three general musical identities, which we have slightly more exposure to in comparison to other musical cultures, namely Western European classical music, traditional Chinese music, and Balinese gamelan. But as I believe a lot of us here are Western conservatory trained musicians, I will focus more on deconstructing the identifiable elements within traditional Chinese music and Balinese gamelan. There are 6 elements which were identified to potentially have associations to these 2 musical identities, including scale materials, microtonality, pitch bends and vibrato, ornamentation and embellishment, musical time, and sonic space. Let us first talk about scale materials. We often think of violinist gamelan as just using the 5-tone padlock scale and traditional Chinese music being in pentatonic. On first glance, it will be very hard to juxtapose them convincingly because the intervallic relationship between the 2 scales are just too different. By approximating them in Western staff notation, the major pentatonic is constructed with adjacent intervals of 3 major seconds and 2 minor thirds, while the 5-tone padlock is constructed with 2 minor seconds, 1 major second, and 2 major thirds. However, there is also Chinese music, which employs the 4th degree and the 7th degree, which are called 变子 and 变语, respectively. According to the Shiji, which is a historical record of China, the 变子 is implied to have a quality that makes people weep. This may mean in some music, these tones are not treated as a chromatic note to the pentatonic scale, but more as an essential tone to the scale. On the other hand, the 5-tone padlock that we know of from the gamelan gong kabir is called padlock siliceal, which is actually a 5-tone subset of the mode or a mode of the 7-tone padlock scale. So if we include all the notes from the 7-tone padlock scale and use their subsets, we can have a wider harmonic palette for our keys. However, just juxtaposing them alone while having them in 12-tone equal temperament won't sound very much different from what you get from early 20th century Western classical music, which is why microtonality comes into play. A lot of the colors that you can get from traditional Chinese music and violinist gamelan stem from the difference in tuning systems and the use of microtonality. In violinist gamelan, pairs of instruments are tuned slightly apart from each other to produce interference beatings. This is a concept known to them as ombak, or translated in English as waves. On top of that, the intervals between the notes of the scales are tuned to not be in 12-tone equal temperament, giving a rise to potential different note groups sounding either more dissonant or more consonant than the 12-tone equal temperament tuning. The nuances within microtonality is also emphasized by the use of pitch bends and vibrato in traditional Chinese music. Chinese instruments like the Guzheng are designed in a way which makes the pitch bends and vibrato an essential component in the music in terms of both performance technique and the listening experience. The different ways of playing the pitch bends and vibrato are prominent enough that they get attributed to the various styles of Guzheng playing, such as the Zhejiang style or the Shandong style, where each of these styles will create a different expressive quality to the music. Pitch bends and vibrato are also employed extensively in violinist gamelan by using the 2 pitch flexible instruments, which are the suling, a bamboo flute, and the rebab, a spiked fiddle. In the same vein of bends and vibrato, traditional Chinese music also emphasizes a lot on the ornamentation and embellishments as an expressive element integral to the quality of the music. These embellishments originated from an imitation of melodic inflections in Chinese vocal music in opera. And the differences in embellishments are also attributed to different musical styles in Chinese music. On the other hand, embellishments in violinist gamelan exist in the form of kotekan, which are fast interlocking patterns in violinist gamelan. Kotekan serves to highlight and drive the main melody of the piece by highlighting its contours and rhythmic outlines. There is also the aspect of musical time, which is rather difficult to analyze. While the previously mentioned kotekan can be thought of as having a clear tempo due to the interlocking patterns contributing to a rhythm, the fact that they are used more as a driving force for the melody may hint at a different way in which we should conceive musical time. Instead, the violinist beats of the gamelan serve more as a punctual function than a durational one, which is punctuated by the kajab, a small kettle with punctuating staccato sounds. Besides that, tempo changes in these musical practices are very difficult to quantize. In subgenres of Chinese music such as Teochew opera, the musicians rely on this temporal concept which they call qi, or the breath, in order to coordinate musicians together. This is further complicated by the way in which when the musicians can change tempo immediately based on the different ways of playing the small drums when you get that in the Teochew puppet opera. Yeah. Lastly, the differences in the use of sonic spaces in both traditional Chinese music and violinist gamelan are rather prominent. I'm using the term sonic space here in place of the term texture. Because while we may categorize such music as heterophonic, it's much more complicated than that because, for example, the sustained resonances of violins gamelan will produce something which could be potentially heard as harmony. As such, it may be more helpful if we think of musical texture as a more multi-dimensional spectrum instead of fixed classifications. So for example, Chinese chamber music has an intimate and subtle sonic space, especially since there's an emphasis on ornamentations and melodic inflections in their music. This greatly contrasts the music of violins gamelan, which is often described as having a shimmering and agitated sonic quality to it, partly due to the interference beatings and the resonances of the instruments. These different ways of utilizing sonic spaces make the music sound much more unique, as it is often the easiest for listeners to make sense of the sound work as compared to aspects like musical development. So we have deconstructed the 6 identifiable elements which can potentially play a role in our process of resynthesizing them into a more assimilated artistic identity, namely the elements of scale materials, microtonality, pitch bends and vibrato, ornamentations and embellishments, musical time, and sonic space. And with that information, we can move on to the process of resynthesis. I will first expand on the ideation processes of the piece, and then talk about how the deconstructed elements are resynthesized to realize the ideas of the piece. The ideation of the process of a piece is mainly governed by Western contemporary classical compositional thinking, largely because this allows for a very modular way of working composition, similar to the Lego analogy that we talked about earlier. 4 broad types of sounds are used in this piece, namely swell, hit, sustain, and embellishment. The idea behind using these 4 sound categories are inspired by the instrumental gestures of the Guzheng as well as the sonic qualities of the gongs in gamelan. I'll delve into each of these sound types, explaining the idea behind its conception and how we recreated it using different ways of putting together deconstructed elements. Firstly, the idea of a swell is conceived from the common pre-cadential gesture in some of the Guzheng solo pieces, especially when glissando and growing tremolo comes into play. The idea of a swell is also from how the gong has somewhat of a growing resonance when it was hit. Secondly, the idea of a hit is inspired by both the idea of a gong hit, as said, as well as the differences in the attack sounds of Chinese, Balinese, and Western instruments. For both the harp and the Guzheng, the way in which it is played may produce attack sounds ranging from imperceptible attack to the loud striking sounds of a harp string. The sustain are then the result of resonances from the hit. The idea is parallel to how the resonances of the gongs in gamelan is essential to the character of the piece, while both the Guzheng and the harp are designed without dampers, which it makes them resonate even more until the sound fades out or until the resonances are manually muted. The last sound category of embellishments refer to the tiny and discrete sounds which add character to the music and alters the sonic space. This idea is a reference to the importance of embellishments and ornamentations in traditional Chinese music and Balinese gamelan, but it can also seen as potential material to build into a swell, to emulate hits on a smaller scale, or to extend sustains in the sonic space. These 4 materials are then presented as having a cyclical relationship at the beginning, but as the piece progresses, different parts of this cycle are highlighted or subverted, making it a more multi-dimensional relationship than a cyclical or linear causal relationship. In order to facilitate the realization of these ideas, we look at the deconstructed elements. Firstly, microtonality is employed by detuning the adjacent notes of the harp slightly off from the 12-tone equal temperament tuning at the lower registers, and then gradually more detuned as the register goes higher. The Guzheng is also detuned in a somewhat similar manner, but with the notes approximated to F-sharp major pentatonic instead of the more common D major pentatonic tuning, such that the Guzheng covers all the black keys on the piano and the harp covers all the white keys on the piano by default. With the help of the electronics, this way of working with microtonality by detuning with reference to equal temperament facilitates the production of interference beatings with various beat frequencies. Unlike the mostly consistent speed of beatings across different registers in a Balinese gamelan, the juxtaposition of beating with different speeds would then create something akin to embellishments in the form of a rhythm complex, similar to the concept of a cortecan from Balinese gamelan. On top of that, when these beat frequencies get into human pitch perception range, it will result in the combination tones which we can hear. This essentially adds to the sustain of the sound, and the stacking of combination tones would effectively morph the sustain into a swell. On top of that, the musical time is treated in various degrees of strictness to contribute to the sonic quality of the embellishment, sustains, and swells. This ranges from a more strict tempo in the manner of Western classical music to a semi-strict sense where space notation with goalposts and approximations of musical events were used, and to total unrestricted temporality. This was a decision to experiment on the imagined possibilities based on the understanding of musical time in Chinese music and Balinese gamelan, where beats may be more punctual than durational. With the electronics governing the strictness of time in the macrostructure of the music, while allowing for partial flexibility in the microstructure, we thought that this way of dealing with it may have more possibilities in making musical events feel more punctuational, as the sound of the focus of the sound shifts to the existence of the event itself, rather than the timing in which the event happens. With that note, the organic interaction between the instrumentalist and the electronics may create a sense of interlocking gestures, which can be perceived as embellishments. The resulting density of the musical events will then create a sense of a sustained state, and the increase in its density will cause a swell in the sonic space. The electronics also serve an important role in the piece, as they have the ability to easily produce all four sound materials of swell, hit, sustain, and embellishment. The adaptability of the electronics allows for a layering of different deconstructed musical identities while having control over the perceptibility of these sonic materials, which allows us to control the focus of musical attention better. Thus, elements of pitch bends, embellishments, and microtonality are included in the electronics with various degrees of perceptibility to create the four sound materials. Furthermore, the electronics utilizes the sonic space not only by means of spatialization across 6 speakers, which you can see across the room, but also through the contrast of obvious presence, subtle presence, and total absence of the electronics, creating a full sonic space at times similar to the sound works of a Western classical orchestra and Balinese gamelan, while occasionally mirroring the intimacy of Chinese chamber music in other subsections. To conclude, the process of trying to understand and deconstruct our multiple identities have led us to experiment of resynthesizing these ideas into a piece, which hopefully proposes a plausible direction forward in this difficult task of negotiating artistic identities as a young artist in a cosmopolitan society today. With that being said, we will be presenting this new piece co-composed by Joan and myself, performed by Vanessa on the harp and Xin Tong on the Guzheng.
So, if you were wondering what the title of our piece is, I'll be honest, we haven't decided on it yet. There's an important need for us to further evaluate this mode of thinking on the deconstruction and resynthesis of artistic identities. Giving the piece a name may frame it in a less than ideal manner. So we are wondering, how do we move forward from this? So firstly, we need to determine if we are generalizing these characteristics which we associate to the music of the different cultures. If we look at traditional Chinese music and Indonesian gamelan music as a whole, it's easy to stereotype the characteristics that we have deconstructed, even though it's thoroughly researched. This is because we often make sense of new knowledge by generalizing them. But within cultures, there are subcultures and there are subgenres and subgenres of music, which can have characteristics that seem negligible to an outsider, but are considered essential by a practitioner of those cultures. The question remains as to how we can negotiate which elements should be employed in the resynthesis of artistic identities. We will also need to be aware of the historical developments of these musical cultures so that we can have a clearer picture of how their perception of music and aesthetics changed over time. It may also be helpful to understand the extra musical context which might have had consequences on the development of music, such as social, political, and economic issues that happened within a culture throughout history. With an increased awareness of such nuances and being able to deconstruct them further, the new challenge lies in making a resynthesized product that's more aesthetically cohesive and effective. Using this piece that we have presented as a referential point, the aspects of embellishment, sonic space, time, musical form, and notation may need further rethinking.
Firstly, how do we better incorporate the idea of embellishments, ornamentations, pitch bends, and vibrato in such a way that is really experientially integral to the piece's identity? My Western classical brain would suggest that I highlight these embellishments explicitly as a core material of the piece. But this manner of thinking will conflict with how embellishments are used in the traditional Chinese music in the first place. Such elements are often, if not never, made as the absolute foreground of the sonic material in traditional Chinese music. But they are more often employed as an expressive character to the music, which contributes to the quality of the piece as a whole. Secondly, what is the common ground in the sonic spaces of music across these three different cultures? Are there better ways to deal with it rather than just switching and contrasting the sonic spaces? As mentioned during the deconstruction process, there may be more possibilities in finding the common ground in musical textures, musical sonic spaces, if we think of them more as multi-dimensional spectrums instead of classifications. Furthermore, it is also important to study how musicians and composers from different cultures think about musical texture, as this may provide perspectives into the different dimensions of texture which I was talking about. Thirdly, given that musical time can only be understood, well, across time, how does one bring together different temporalities, different senses of time cohesively into one single piece? Is it possible for these different senses of time to be assimilated instead of juxtaposed on top of each other? Or is it not possible at all, since time is always perceived linearly or horizontally? As much as the sense of time in the interlocking kotekan from Balinese gamelan and the free meter in some of the Chinese traditional pieces contradict each other, the fact that the sense of time can be constructed as a result of melody means that there may be a way to potentially bind together the musical identities together temporally. And fourthly, how does one bring together different ways of thinking about musical forms across different cultures? Although thinking about musical form in terms of construction of very small fragments of motifs or sounds can be easy to resynthesize it into something new, this is fundamentally Western compositional thinking, which may not align with how Eastern and Southeast Asian musical cultures conceive musical forms. Musical form in this context is also probably the most complicated topic, since changes in any other musical elements that we have discussed thus far may potentially change the piece's form. With all these considerations in mind, the music that a composer wishes to convey may get so convoluted that we might need to devise a new form of notation. If we use the Western staff notation for such music, it could mean that we are bounding together non-Western cultures into this concretized way of conveying musical messages. There's also a question of how much should we notate and how much should we leave it out for interpretation, and whether this process of further quantization and concretization of musical elements is actually helpful to the process of assimilating different musical identities together. All of these aforementioned ideas were possible directions we proposed to answer the question of how do we construct our artistic identities as young artists in a cosmopolitan society, noting that a consensus of aesthetics across different identities may be difficult to achieve. We will have to identify the multiple identities that we have today, deconstruct them to recognize the essential elements within the different identities, and re-synthesize them in order to assimilate them into a more cohesive artistic identity. I believe this process will take a number of decades, if not centuries, in order to reach a point of stability in assimilation. Once that is achieved, composers in the future wishing to use this new assimilated thinking in composition will have to answer the question of how do we use this then as a foundation to create and envision musical and artistic experience, similarly to how Western composers in the past who used established techniques of counterpoint, functional tonality, serialism, and so on to musically re-synthesize their vision. Before we end, we would like to ask for your opinions on this presentation by scanning this QR code and filling out the survey so that we can evaluate whether or not this is effective at all. And with that, we will end our presentation here. Thank you very much.
Before we leave, I'd just like to thank the AAS students, those that are in the room helping us with this and those actually running around the whole school. You don't really see them because they are backstage trying to make all technology and everything work. So if you can we give them a hand?
Questions?
Hi, Prof.
I'd first like to acknowledge how ambitious what you've done is, because you're all like in your early 20s. So I think that's quite interesting, and I agree that it's actually in a way good you're doing in the early 20s because I agree with Jellal, this will take decades, and I don't agree it'll take centuries because by that time cultures will have radically transformed.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're trying to pinpoint in a way is where we/you are at this moment, and yet you have to go through a maturation process as an individual/artist in order to figure that out. That's a decades kind of project. Yeah, and actually you actually answered in a way some of the questions that were arising in me as you were trying to say this is what you were thinking about for the future. Because there are issues, and I guess maybe the main question I have, the main comment in a way I want to point out, is this: at first you talk about artistic identities, and you talk about being Singaporean, or being Malaysian, or being Indonesian, ASEAN, etc., and the complexities of these identities, and these are personal identities, national identities, familial identities, etc. Then you went to approach the music, but then what happens is you begin to look at the identity of the music. Right? It's what are the components of it, how can we compare and contrast? And then what you begin to do is to build up a musical identity, actually which is separated from you as individuals, which is kind of where you started, as individuals, asking about artistic identity. And I think finding a way to bring these two things together is really, really important, and and two, extraordinarily difficult. You started, what you did, again, I want to acknowledge what you did was actually quite an achievement. In a way, you also started at the right point / the easiest point of entry, because it's not personal. You see what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. And so, so I really look forward to seeing, first, I welcome any kind of response you have to this, and then second, I look forward to really seeing this evolve over the next couple of decades.
Any other questions?
Well, I just want to say thank you all for your presentation and for the performance. Really, really wonderful piece as well that you composed. What struck me when I was listening to you guys was the parallels in this process of deconstructing and resynthesizing your artistic identities, and as has been pointed out, that might be personal identities, they may be visual identities, they may overlap, they may not. And a couple of other processes. One, a process that we often find even in Western art music, where we have an idea put forward by Schiller of the Bildungsgeschichte, the self-education of consciousness, the idea that often in a big piece of late Beethoven piano sonata or a Mahler symphony or something like that, we have this idea of a thing that's sort of an idea that's presented unproblematically at the start, and then is problematized over the course of what we hear, and then we kind of reach some resolution of that problem. So I was thinking about that. And I was also thinking about similar questions of negotiating artistic and personal identities with other cultural contexts. So in my own country, particularly for Indigenous Australian musicians, when they're trying to synthesize, Western training, Western musical influences with traditional Indigenous musical cultures. And I was just wondering if you guys had looked into, I guess, comparable processes in, shall we say, transplanted contexts, and what similarities or differences you found between those and what you're doing.
That is a very difficult question.
We can chat coffee.
Yeah, sure. I think that would be great. Because wait, how much time do we have left? Okay, so
questions, and then they have then we generate 20 seconds just to say so.
Okay, so for that, I will just summarize kind of a few ideas that we have thought about. Because when we think about this kind of when cultures actually cross each other, cultures take influences from other cultures when they cross paths. And especially when we talked about the social or political constraints that shape a culture, those are very much it's considered as well, and then we would actually try to see what is more, we would think maybe intentional in shaping the culture, or maybe more so fabricated for a reason other than artistic reasons. So if we look at perhaps China, their cultural revolution has actually burnt out a lot of books and treatises on the previous musical practices that they had. And from that point onwards, they started to come up with this concept of a Chinese orchestra. And this concept, as far as I know, it's a concept that's kind of a parallel to a Western orchestra, but then problems arise in that because they're so focused on microtonality, when you put all the instruments together, you just don't get a unisonic sound. So they started introducing more frets to let's say the pipa. So now it has almost double the amount of frets as compared to before. So but that kind of thinking is really, if we trace back, arguably associated with political reasons of trying to say okay, we might be on the same level as the Western orchestra. So that may have altered how these cultures are perceived nowadays. So we try to track what we think may be of the origin that's based on artistic decisions more than any reasons outside of artistic decisions. But that statement itself is very debatable as well, so it's very hard to answer.
No, it's not a simple question to answer. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Very quickly, as someone who was brought up in Latin America, studying Western art music, I also grew up understanding a separation between art and culture, especially in South America. Someone doing these kind of things, you were doing art, and the art was a thing of the other. And a thing of the other that allowed you to transcend and become part of that otherness. And it wasn't until I moved to Europe and realized that art and culture are an intertwined activity and a concept, and there's a reason why the culture centrums are better financed in smaller towns that are closer to borders than in big cities in Europe. And throughout your presentation, what I found interesting is that there were this, as Peter was very aptly pointing out, there is this shifting and back and forth between the focus on identity from an artistic perspective, a focus of the artist doing art, a focus on the cultural identity that kind of music represents, so the acknowledgement of a way that is much more than the deconstructed and resynthesized musical atoms that any composer from outside those cultures will take, and they have taken for a long period of time, and appropriate it in a way that where those cliches pop up much more than in the result that we presented today. You know? So my question actually is, through this process, and again, pointing at what Peter was putting the finger on, when you start realizing that, for example, the Singaporean current artistic and cultural life comes into a place of fusion where, for example, ambitious professional composers collaborate, like co-compose, that is really difficult to find in a world where cynicism is so patent and everyone is more competing than working together. So I wonder if that is actually the identity of the cultural asset that you're helping develop.
Sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts.
I don't know whether we really thought about it as like, I mean, it's interesting that you pointed out, because I don't think we really thought about it as like our identity or culture that we were making. It was just something we wanted to do, and we thought, okay, let's find a way to co-compose this. Let's find a way to work with like Vanessa and Xin Tong, for example, and also Kingdom, because this whole thing started off actually because we were sitting at like 2 a.m. in the morning at U-Town talking about, after attending a concert, and talking about this issue of Singaporean music and the combination of fusion of cultures. So it could be. We just don't quite know. But it's an interesting thing to find out.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? I really like some of the questions that have been asked. My first thought was actually to Vanessa and Xin Tong, because you have been intimately involved in the creation of this piece of music, but not the composing of it. So what did the two of you think about this entire process and working together?
I will treat them to Hai Di Lao.
Admittedly, I was very excited about this collaboration because me and Vanessa are like really good friends. So like for them to like bring us together in this opportunity and like trying to like, I guess like dissect our identities and bring it into a piece like that, I'm like really thankful for the piece. Yeah, but I think when I played the piece, it's quite a big jump from me from what I usually do, because whether it's like Chinese music or Western music, like I have like a certain set of like way to play it, and it's not so like contemporary in this sense, but I feel like for this piece, to me, I mean, it still feels like it's quite like a Western way of approaching, like through the score and like the preciseness in the kind of like timbres that we need to use. Yeah, so I guess, but I know that like this is just an experimentation, and just like how two of them just mentioned, like maybe Western notation is not the best way to present or like try to communicate these ideas, and maybe like we can bring this further and like try to experiment what are the other ways we can like incorporate these like different elements between like the harp and Guzheng, or like the different cultural elements of the music. Yeah.
I think for me, I would want to talk more about how do I feel when I do this kind of thing. So the first time when they sent us the tuning where I should actually retune the harp, it's actually very strange for me, but this is the first time I heard my harp can be sound and played this way. And sometimes I actually not a very big fan of contemporary music and 20th century music, to be honest. But actually, when I do this kind of thing, I really appreciate and amazed by like the thoughts and the effort that they make to, okay, this note is plus 39 Cs and 7. I don't know, it's minus something, and all of the number they come up because they think of it, and like imagine thinking about every string, like how many cents that they want to put. So even though I'm not the big fan of this contemporary music, but I really I'm grateful for the opportunity that I can join and do this kind of thing, and also try to be curious of how they think about it. And when I ask them like, okay, so what do you want us to do? And what's the meaning of this section, that kind of thing. So I think what's very interesting through this collaboration is because for me, it's so many strange sound. It's not like the, my usual like classical music that I usually play. So I think it's more of finding what me and Xin Tong can synchronize to each other. So within all the strangeness that I feel, I can feel that I'm collaborating and we're trying to combine together and trying to highlighting all the notes that we are together, all of the places that we are making a new thing together. So I think that's what's like the most interesting for me.
Sorry, I just want to mention like, sorry, okay, no. I mean, like for me, cause like how the score was planned was like it's given chord chart equals 60, but we still need to like play, like improvise within this frame of 60 beat. And actually, it's very hard for me because for me it's like you either give me the exact rhythm or you tell me to play completely free. But I think when we rehearse together, I kind of appreciate it after a while because I think this really like forced us to like coordinate our timings, and I guess like in this way we also kind of like feel more connected in the musical realm. So even though it comes with challenges, like over time I can see it like really helping us to like fuse and connect together.
The first time we tuned the harp and everything, Vanessa played Debussy in microtone, and and we recorded it, and it was actually kind of cool to me, but she was like, what is this?
All right. In the interest of time, we have to stop it here, like stop our presentation
It's
here.
lunch.
And it's lunchtime, and I think we'll be down for lunch as well. So if you have any more questions, please do feel free to come talk to us, or you can just scan the QR code. My email is included there, so